Picture this. A lone figure stands perfectly still at the edge of a small-town memorial park, right arm raised in a solemn salute. The summer sun beats down mercilessly, his shadow barely moving across the scorched grass. Staff Sergeant Mike Callahan, his left leg visibly damaged, refuses to shift his weight despite the obvious discomfort. Sweat drips from his brow, but his eyes remain fixed on the modest memorial wall bearing the names of fallen soldiers from his hometown. "Sir, you really should take a break. It's been almost 2 hours," a concerned park attendant says, offering a bottle of water. Mike doesn't flinch. "Can't do that, ma'am. I made a promise." The few visitors to the park that afternoon cast curious glances, some stopping to take photos of the strange sight. A group of teenagers laugh nearby, one mockingly saluting before being hushed by his friends. "That crazy vet has been there since noon," one whispers loudly enough for Mike to hear. Pain radiates through Mike's shoulder into his neck, but his arm remains steady. His prosthetic leg hidden beneath his khaki pants presses uncomfortably against his residual limb, but still, he stands. On the highway just beyond the park, a distant rumble grows louder. A convoy of motorcycles appears on the horizon, dozens of them, their chrome flashing in the afternoon sun. They slow as they approach the park entrance, engines growling like predators. Little did anyone know, the arrival of these leather-clad riders would transform this small act of remembrance into something none of them would ever forget. Let me take you back to where it all began. 3 weeks earlier, Mike Callahan sat in his modest living room, methodically polishing his service medals. At 42, his once athletic frame still carried the discipline of his military years, though his movements were measured, deliberate. The explosion that had taken his leg 6 years ago in Afghanistan had left him with more than physical scars. He'd spent the last 3 years in this small town of Riverdale, mostly keeping to himself. Mike had always been known for his unshakable determination. During his 15 years of service, he'd earned a reputation for never leaving a task unfinished, never abandoning a mission. His fellow soldiers used to joke that Mike was more stubborn than a government-issue mule. That same determination had gotten him through 18 months of grueling physical therapy when doctors weren't sure he'd walk again. His home reflected his ordered mind. Simple, functional furniture arranged with military precision. Photos of his former unit lined one wall, including a prominently displayed picture of his best friend, Marcus Jones, arms thrown around each other's shoulders, desert dust coating their uniforms. "Another year, buddy," Mike murmured to the photograph. "Can't believe it's been 7 years now." The upcoming anniversary of Marcus's death weighed heavily on him. Every year, Mike honored his friend in some way. This year needed to be different. Marcus had saved 4 other soldiers before stepping on the IED that killed him instantly. He deserved more than private remembrance. Outside, Riverdale carried on with its peaceful small-town rhythm. Kids rode bikes down tree-lined streets, the local hardware store owner swept his sidewalk, and elderly couples walked their dogs through the neighborhood. Mike watched this from his porch, sipping coffee, nodding politely at neighbors who still treated him with a mixture of respect and uncertainty. Sheriff Tom Reeves slowed his patrol car as he passed Mike's house. "Morning, Staff Sergeant." "Morning, Sheriff," Mike replied, raising his coffee mug slightly. Of all the townspeople, Tom had made the most effort to make Mike feel welcome, having served a tour in Desert Storm himself. From across the street, Mike noticed Mrs. Peterson watching him through her curtains. He'd caught her staring many times before. Sometimes she'd quickly look away. Other times she'd offer a tight smile that never reached her eyes. Her son had died in Iraq, and Mike wondered if his presence was a painful reminder. For weeks, Mike had been researching how other veterans had honored their fallen comrades. He'd seen viral videos of remarkable tributes, flag installations, cross-country journeys, fundraising events, but nothing felt right for Marcus, until he remembered their pact. During a particularly grueling mission, Marcus had joked, "If I don't make it back, promise you'll salute me until your arm falls off." Mike had laughed then, replying, 3 hours, best I can do." "Deal," Marcus had said, shaking on it. The memory crystallized into a plan. Mike would stand at the town's Veteran Memorial and hold a salute for 3 full hours on the anniversary of Marcus's death. A simple, powerful tribute that felt exactly right. The next morning, Mike made his way to the town hall to request permission to conduct his tribute at the memorial park. The building buzzed with the efficient energy of small-town administration. Employees greeted him politely as he approached the main desk. "I'd like to speak with someone about holding an event at the memorial park," Mike explained to the receptionist. "That would be Mr. Daniels, our park's administrator," she replied, picking up her phone. "Let me see if he's available." Minutes later, a slightly overweight man with thinning hair approached. "Walter Daniels," he introduced himself, extending his hand. "What can I do for you, Mr. Callahan?" "Staff Sergeant Michael Callahan," Mike replied, shaking his hand firmly. "I'd like permission to hold a small tribute at the Veterans Memorial next Friday. It's the anniversary of a fellow soldier's death." Walter's eyes narrowed slightly. "What kind of tribute are we talking about?" "The memorial park has strict rules about events." "Nothing disruptive," Mike assured him. "I'll be standing at attention and holding a salute for 3 hours. Just me. No crowd. No noise." Walter frowned, tapping his pen against his desk. 3 hours? In this heat? That seems excessive and potentially dangerous. "I've endured worse, sir. I'm prepared for it." "Well, there are procedures for this sort of thing. Forms to fill out, approval committees." "It's in 2 weeks," Mike interjected. "I don't mean any disrespect, but this is important." Walter sighed. "Look, we've had issues with demonstrations at the park before. Some political group used the space last year and left quite a mess. The town council implemented stricter policies afterward." "This isn't political, it's personal," Mike insisted, leaning forward. "One man honoring a friend who gave his life for this country." Walter studied him for a moment. "I'll need to check with the committee. They meet next Tuesday. I can't promise anything." As Mike turned to leave, Walter added, "And just to be clear, if you proceed without proper authorization, you could face trespassing charges. The memorial might be public, but events there require approval." The subtle threat lingered in the air as Mike nodded and walked out. Outside, he pulled out his phone and dialed a number. "Sheriff Reeves," Mike said when the call connected. "I could use some advice." Over coffee at the local diner, Sheriff Tom Reeves listened as Mike explained his tribute plan and the bureaucratic roadblock he'd encountered. "Walter's just doing his job," Tom said after Mike finished. "But I agree it shouldn't be this complicated. Let me talk to him." "I appreciate that," Mike replied. "But I don't want special treatment." Tom smiled. "It's not special treatment. To cut through unnecessary red tape. Your tribute is exactly the kind of thing that Memorial was built for." 3 days later, Mike received official permission for his tribute, with certain conditions attached. He could proceed with his salute, but would need to sign a liability waiver and could not obstruct regular park visitors. The hours were restricted to between 12 p.m. and 3 p.m., and he could not erect any signs, banners, or other displays. Mike was in the hardware store purchasing supplies for a project when Walter Daniels approached him in the paint aisle. "I see you got your permission," Walter said, his tone neutral but his posture tense. "Yes, thank you for processing it," Mike replied evenly. Walter lowered his voice. "Between us, I think this whole thing is a bit melodramatic. There are more practical ways to honor veterans. The VFW does fundraisers, for instance." Mike measured his response carefully. "Everyone grieves differently. Just keep it low-key," Walter advised. "Some people in town are sensitive about military displays. Mrs. Peterson's son, for instance." "I'm well aware of Mrs. Peterson's loss," Mike interrupted. "This isn't about politics or drawing attention. It's a promise I made." Walter nodded skeptically before moving on. As Mike watched him go, he couldn't help feeling that his tribute had already been misunderstood. In the days leading up to the anniversary, Mike prepared methodically. He worked on his endurance, practicing holding a salute for increasingly longer periods. He researched heat exhaustion, prevention, and planned his fluid intake carefully. He had his prosthetic leg adjusted to ensure maximum stability for prolonged standing. Word about his planned tribute spread through town. Reactions were mixed. Some veterans from the local VFW expressed support, offering to bring water and stand with him for parts of the tribute. Others questioned the point of such a physical ordeal. "What are you trying to prove?" asked Frank Miller, another veteran, when they crossed paths at the grocery store. "Nothing," Mike answered honestly. "It's between me and Marcus." "Well, I think it's admirable," said the cashier, an older woman named Martha. "My father served in Vietnam. These young people today could use a reminder of what sacrifice looks like." The night before the tribute, Mike couldn't sleep. He sat on his porch, watching the stars and thinking about Marcus. They'd met in basic training, 2 farm boys who'd joined up for similar reasons. Part patriotism, part escape from small towns with limited futures. They'd served together through 4 deployments, becoming closer than brothers. Mike's phone buzzed with a text from Tom. "All set for tomorrow. I'll stop by in my patrol car periodically to make sure everything's going smoothly." As dawn broke on the anniversary, Mike dressed methodically in his Class A uniform. He attached his service medals with precision, polished his shoes one last time, and secured his prosthetic leg. He packed a small bag with water bottles and drove to the memorial park. The memorial itself was modest, a curved stone wall with the names of local fallen soldiers etched into its surface. Marcus's name wasn't there. He'd been from a different town. But Mike had secured permission to place a small photograph at the base of the wall during his tribute. At precisely noon, Mike assumed his position and began his salute. The day was brutally hot, the humidity making the air feel thick. A few curious onlookers watched as he stood ramrod straight, his right hand fixed in a perfect salute, eyes forward. For the first hour, the physical discomfort was manageable. Mike had mentally prepared for this, focusing his mind on memories of Marcus to distract from the growing strain in his shoulder and arm. A few park visitors stopped to watch, some taking photos, others asking questions that Mike couldn't answer while maintaining his silent vigil. By the beginning of the second hour, the real challenge began. His shoulder burned, his lower back ached from maintaining perfect posture, and his residual limb throbbed where it connected to his prosthetic. Sweat soaked through his uniform, and his vision occasionally blurred from salt stinging his eyes. Walter Daniels appeared briefly, clipboard in hand, ostensibly checking that Mike was adhering to the agreed conditions. He seemed disappointed to find nothing to complain about, and left after a few minutes. A young couple with a small boy approached. The child stared at Mike with wide eyes. "Why is that man standing like that, Mommy?" the boy asked loudly. "He's honoring someone special who died," his mother explained softly. The father nodded respectfully to Mike before guiding his family away. By the middle of the second hour, a small crowd had gathered, respectfully keeping their distance. Sheriff Reeves arrived, surveying the scene before approaching Mike. "Everything okay?" he asked quietly. Mike gave an almost imperceptible nod, never breaking his salute. "Your friend would be proud," Tom said, then stepped back to join the growing crowd. The pain was becoming unbearable now. Mike's arm trembled slightly, and each minute felt like an hour. But he refused to lower his arm or shift position. He'd endured worse pain for less meaningful reasons. The photograph of Marcus smiled up at him from the base of the memorial wall, giving him strength. It was during this struggle that Mike first noticed the teenagers. 4 boys, probably high school age, were tossing a football dangerously close to the memorial. Their laughter and loud conversations disrupted the respectful atmosphere that had developed around Mike's tribute. "Dude, check out G.I. Joe over there," one of them said loud enough for everyone to hear. "What's he supposed to be doing?" "Playing statue," another replied, snickering. "Hey, think he'd move if the ball hit him?" Sheriff Reeves started to move toward them, but was called away by a radio message requiring his immediate attention. Before leaving, he shot the teens a warning look, which they ignored as soon as he drove away. The teenagers' disrespect escalated. Gradually, they moved closer, making jokes about soldiers and throwing their football perilously close to Mike. The small crowd of observers seemed uncertain how to respond, some shooting disapproving glances, others choosing to leave rather than witness the growing tension. A particularly bold teen, wearing a backward cap and an oversized basketball jersey, approached to within a few feet of Mike. "Yo, buddy, how long you planning to stand there? Don't your arms get tired?" he asked mockingly, waving his hand in front of Mike's face. Mike remained perfectly still, focusing on a distant point, though his jaw clenched almost imperceptibly. "I think he's broken," the teen called back to his friends. "Maybe he needs a reboot." He reached out as if to touch Mike's shoulder. "That's enough," came a firm voice. Mrs. Peterson had emerged from the small crowd of onlookers. "Show some respect or leave," the teen rolled his eyes. "It's a free country, lady. Isn't that what he fought for, or whatever?" Mrs. Peterson stepped between Mike and the boy. "My son died fighting for this country. This man is honoring soldiers like him. Your freedom doesn't give you the right to disrespect their sacrifice." This revelation temporarily subdued the teenagers, who retreated to a bench nearby, still watching and occasionally making quiet remarks among themselves. Mrs. Peterson looked up at Mike, their eyes meeting briefly. "I'm sorry about them," she said softly, "and I'm sorry it took me so long to welcome you to our town properly. David, my son, he would have appreciated what you're doing here today." Mike maintained his salute, but his eyes conveyed his gratitude. As the third hour began, Mike was in agony. His muscles screamed for relief, his prosthetic leg felt like it was grinding against bone, and dizziness threatened to overcome him, but he was determined to complete the full 3 hours. Marcus deserved nothing less. The group of observers had grown to about 30 people. Some had brought chairs and sat in respectful silence. Others stood with their hands over their hearts. An elderly veteran in a wheelchair had been brought by his daughter, and he sat watching Mike with tears streaming down his weathered face. It was just past 2:30 p.m. when the distant rumble of motorcycles grew steadily louder. At first, it was just a background noise, but it quickly became clear that a large group was approaching the park. Heads turned as the first motorcycles appeared. At the park entrance, massive bikes piloted by men and women in leather vests covered in patches. The Righteous Defenders Motorcycle Club had a reputation in 3 states. Founded by Vietnam veterans, they'd evolved into a diverse group of riders, many of whom had military backgrounds. They were known for their charity rides and their zero-tolerance policy for disrespect toward veterans. More than 40 motorcycles rolled into the park, forming a semicircle at a respectful distance from where Mike stood. Their engines cut simultaneously, leaving an electric silence. The teenagers who had been causing trouble earlier quickly gathered their things and left, intimidated by the sudden arrival. A tall, heavily bearded man dismounted from his bike and approached the gathering. He wore a leather vest covered with military patches and a hat identifying him as Commander, the club president. "We heard about this tribute through some vets. In the next county over," he announced to the crowd. "Thought we'd come pay our respects." The bikers formed a line, creating a protective barrier between Mike and the rest of the park. They stood at attention, many rendering their own salutes. Others placed hands over their hearts. As the 3-hour mark approached, Mike was visibly struggling. His uniform was soaked with sweat, his face pale despite the heat. His arm trembled, continuously now, and those watching feared he might collapse at any moment. Commander approached Mike and spoke quietly. "Staff Sergeant, you've honored your brother. No one would think less of you for finishing a few minutes early." Mike's voice was barely audible. 3 hours. I promised him 3 hours. Commander nodded in understanding and stepped back. At exactly 3 o'clock, a bugler from among the bikers played Taps, the haunting melody drifting across the park. As the last note faded, Mike finally lowered his arm and took a stumbling step backward. Commander and another biker moved quickly to steady him. Mike's legs gave way, and they carefully helped him to sit on a nearby bench. Someone handed him water, which he drank gratefully. What happened next was entirely unexpected. Commander returned to his motorcycle and retrieved a folded piece of cloth from his saddlebag. He walked back to Mike and gently placed it in his hands. It was a carefully preserved American flag. "This flag was draped over my son's coffin when he came home from Iraq," Commander explained, his voice thick with emotion. "I've kept it safe all these years, waiting for the right moment to pass it on. Today, seeing your dedication, I know it belongs with you now." Mike stared at the flag in disbelief, understanding the magnitude of such a gift. Then, one by one, the bikers approached. Each placed something next to Mike on the bench: challenge coins from their units, patches from their service days, photographs of fallen friends, handwritten letters of gratitude. The impromptu collection grew as each biker contributed a personal token of respect. "We're going to create a proper display for all of these," Commander announced. "A traveling memorial that will take to events across the country. Each item tells a story of sacrifice, and each story deserves to be heard." By now, many in the crowd were openly weeping. Mrs. Peterson approached with a framed photograph. "This is my David," she said, placing it with the other tributes. "I'd be honored if he could be part of this memorial, too." Mike finally found his voice. "Marcus, the friend I was honoring, he always said that the true measure of a life is found in how it touched others." He gestured to the collected tributes. "This is beyond anything I could have imagined." Commander placed a hand on Mike's shoulder. "Your tribute today touched a nerve, Staff Sergeant. Sometimes people need to see dedication like yours to remember what really matters." As the crowd began to disperse, the bikers invited Mike to join them for a meal at the local diner. Too exhausted to drive himself, Mike accepted a ride on the back of Commander's motorcycle, his uniform still damp with sweat, his body aching, but his heart lighter than it had been in years. At the diner, the bikers filled every table and booth, their laughter and stories creating an atmosphere of camaraderie that Mike had deeply missed since leaving the service. They shared tales of their fallen friends, not with sorrow, but with celebration of lives fully lived. The diner owner refused to accept payment. "Meals are on the house today," she insisted. "My brother served in the Gulf War. This is the least I can do." Walter Daniels appeared at the diner door, surveying the scene with a mixture of surprise and contrition. He approached Mike's table hesitantly. "That was quite something today," he admitted. "I may have misjudged your intentions. The town could use more reminders of sacrifice like that." Mike nodded in acceptance of the closest thing to an apology he was likely to get. As the evening wound down, Commander outlined the plans for the traveling memorial. "We'll build a custom display case on a trailer. We'll bring it to veteran events, schools, anywhere people need to be reminded. Each item will have a plaque telling its story." "Marcus would have loved that," Mike said. "He was always saying we need to tell our stories better." 1 year later, Mike stood at the same memorial park, but not alone. Beside him were dozens of bikers from the Righteous Defenders and hundreds of community members. The traveling memorial, now a professional display with over 200 items, was parked nearby for viewing. The annual tribute had evolved into a community event, with veterans from surrounding counties participating. Mike still performed his 3-hour salute, but now others joined him in shifts, ensuring that a continuous salute was maintained from dawn until dusk. Mrs. Peterson had become a close friend, often joining Mike for coffee and sharing stories of their loved ones. The teenagers who had once mocked the tribute now volunteered to help set up the event. Their attitudes transformed after spending time listening to veterans' stories. Sheriff Reeves approached Mike before the ceremony began. "You've changed this town, you know that? People talk to each other differently now. They listen more." Mike shook his head. "I just stood and remembered, my friend. Everything else happened because people were ready for it." The memorial had expanded to include an educational component, with schools bringing students to learn about service and sacrifice. The Righteous Defenders had established a scholarship fund in Marcus's name for local students pursuing careers in public service. Commander, his beard now streaked with more gray, clapped Mike on the shoulder. "Ready to do this again?" Mike nodded, looking out at the gathered crowd. Marcus used to say that no one is ever truly gone as long as someone remembers them. "Well," Commander replied, gesturing to the hundreds of people waiting for the ceremony to begin, "it looks like a lot of people will be remembering for a long time to come." As Mike took his position and raised his hand in salute, he reflected on how a simple promise kept had rippled outward in ways he could never have predicted. The pain in his shoulder would still come. His leg would still ache. But now he understood something that had eluded him since returning home wounded: the power of visible remembrance. Behind him, the bikers formed their now traditional honor guard. Ahead of him, the community that had once been distant now stood in respectful attention. And somewhere, he was certain, Marcus was watching with his characteristic grin, perhaps saying, "See? I told you it would be worth it." If you've been moved by this story of remembrance and respect, we'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Have you witnessed or participated in a powerful tribute to our veterans? Did this story remind you of someone special in your life who served? Share your experiences with our community. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories that highlight the extraordinary moments in ordinary lives. And remember, sometimes the most meaningful tributes aren't the grandest ones. They're the ones that come from a promise kept, no matter the cost.